I think it's fair to say that we live in dark times, that we're surrounded by darkness, by evil, by chaos, and by sin. It can rightly be said that we live in a world that hates God, that rages against him, that is probably very similar to the Philistines. And there's really no way around this. There's nowhere you can look where the perversity of the world that we live in does not taint the very fabric of everything that we see, where paganism doesn't kind of protrude into the things that we want to keep safe and secure for our daily life. And the general feeling, I think, of many Christians is perhaps one of despair with regard to our country and the political environment. When we look around the world, when we look around the general direction of the religious life of American people, you look at the last 2 to 3 years, the COVID virus, the situation in Ukraine. There's some dark times. There's some confusing stuff. Things are really not in our control. I've been hearing a lot about even the housing market here in Bozeman, Montana. Nothing's in our control. Where can we look to for security, for our livelihood, for our families, for what we'll do in the future? And perhaps that's why, it's not just us that experiences this lack of control in our own lives. I think that's everybody. We're not God, that's the whole point. And so I think maybe this is why hero stories are so popular in our culture. Something like the Avengers or Justice League, or perhaps James Bond is your thing, or if none of those get you, Rocky Balboa has to be the one. It's not about how hard you get hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and still keep moving, right? In the face of these perilous odds and dark situations, they bring hope. They inspire us, they make us feel a sense of safety, and maybe they set an ideal for what kind of light an individual can bring and what an individual can accomplish. And so our world really looks to stories made with hands by human ingenuity, instead of calling on the name of the Lord, whose story was revealed and weaved together before the foundations of the world according to the counsel of his will. And so no matter how much the world may pretend things are okay and filled with life and light, we know that we live in a place that is stained and darkened by sin, surrounded by cultures and peoples that don't know God, that curse his name, and really tempting us to live life like them, to participate with them in a life of radical sin, raging, as the poet Dylan Thomas wrote, against the dying of the light. So it's a dark world where few call on the name of the Lord. That's a theme in our passage today. But one of the best ways that we can be encouraged in the security that we have and the deliverance of our hope and the provision and the protection of our God is to look at the way that he has provided for and protected his people in history. And what we'll come to find today in the story of Samson is that God is faithful to his covenant promises. Even in the darkest of times, he protects, he provides for, and he delivers his people, even when they fail to call on his name. And we're going to learn this in 4 ways. The first is darkness. The second is distress in verse 1 to 3. The third is destroyer in 4 to 17. And the fourth is deliverer. Darkness, distress, destroyer, and deliverer. Now, like we might say for our own country, Israel, in the days of Samson, was suffering from really dark times. They just settled into the land of Canaan. They'd begun a successful conquest into this region under the leadership of Joshua. But as the beginning of the book of Judges tells us, the man who united these 12 tribes is dead. He's dead. And it leaves this vacuum in the leadership of Israel. They need a leader, and without one, the book of Judges presents to us an Israel in crisis. As the end of the book tells us, we know, kind of reading this back into the rest of the book, there was no king in the land, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So by Judges 15, we get an increasingly dark situation in the religious life of God's people. Things have gotten progressively and progressively worse. By this time, it's absolute anarchy. These are a faithless people. They've been worshiping other gods. They've been intermingling with the pagans. And one of the clearest ways that we know this is that Israel had just moved into this land. They need somebody to teach them really how to care for the land. It would be like if I came out here and I decided that I wanted to grow whatever crop y'all grow out here, and I have no idea how to farm this land. I would need you to tell me how to do it. But the problem is that the Canaanites and the Philistines and the people living in the land, their farming culture was heavily integrated with paganism. So Israel picked up on this. They were intermingling with pagans. How could God preserve the purity of the line of Israel and through Judah provide a savior if they were mingling with the pagans in marriage? So they're called to really ethnic purity in the land and to religious purity, both of which they've abandoned. They're supposed to be purging the land from the Philistine and Canaanite influence. And this is quite difficult for them because not only are they geographically disparate from one another, they're very far. So if the Philistines start to raid the men of Judah, how can they call on help from their neighbors? But Israel also has no idea how to conduct warfare. They're clueless. And much more than this, the Philistines are technologically advanced. They have better weaponry. So it leaves us wondering, with all these circumstances going on, you have faithless Israel who's going after pagan gods, intermingling with the pagans, and has no idea how to conduct warfare. How are they going to survive? How are they going to survive? And that's actually the point of it. God is doing something in Israel. He's testing them and he's teaching them. What God is doing is therefore built into the structure of Israel. Faithless Israel does what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. The result is that God would send the pagan nations to test Israel and to afflict them, that they might return to him. And upon calling out for deliverance, the Lord would raise up a judge to deliver Israel from their hand and from their oppression. And this is to show a couple of things. The first would be who is truly their provider and deliverer. The second would be to instruct them in warfare. And the third, which is a byproduct of the former two, is to show them that they needed a perfect king who could lead them in these regards. But again, we find an exceptionally dark Israel in this chapter. Unlike the other judges, we are never told that the people of God cry out to him when he gave them into the hands of the Philistines. And by the way, we're told when he first raises up the Philistines in chapter 14 that they were rulers over them for 40 years. For 40 years. In fact, during this period, hardly anyone cries out. Really, we can say collectively, no one cries out. Except for Samson in this story. And this silence on behalf of the people indicates covenant abandonment, covenant treason against God. It begs for the Lord, who is the faithful God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to do something, to raise up someone on their behalf. And so the angel of the Lord appears to the wife of Manoah in chapter 14, and he proclaims to her that she would bear a son who would begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. And this is exactly what Samson will do, but Samson is a very interesting judge to do so. Because Samson never executes his office, his duties for the people with the right motives. He will do it by himself, for one, and he will never have an army who stands at his back, like, for instance, Othniel or Deborah. And the way that he goes about doing this is never by intention. Samson only does things when it aligns with his own agendas, when it aligns with his own calendar. So when he opens up his calendar for the day and he sees in our chapter, what am I going to do today? He says, I'm going to go visit my wife, not I'm going to go and afflict the Philistines for afflicting God's people. And so he thus becomes a providential provocateur, a happenstance hooligan. And in chapter 14, he goes and he tells his parents that he will marry this Philistine woman. And despite his parents' protests, which, by the way, children, I don't advise you to ignore the wisdom of your parents when they tell you they don't think you should marry someone. But in this case, Samson, the narrator tells us that despite his parents' protest, Samson's desire for this woman has been orchestrated by God, for through Samson's misplaced motives, the Lord was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. And so we arrive finally at chapter 15. Samson has left his own wedding in distress. And he returns to his wife with a young goat at least to the woman that he considers to be his wife, he returns with this young goat. Now, I'm sure that there are many men today who, on the evening of their own wedding, as Samson did in chapter 14, became so animate that they had to leave, and they returned in the morning with a young goat as a peace offering to appease the anger of their wives. Or perhaps you brought flowers. I think that joke works out here because you guys actually are in an agricultural area. Maybe it was flowers after work for something you said in the morning, tomato, tomato. But really the story that I think we're told here is a really really shocking story. Samson, I think it's fair to say, and I love stories. I think we should read them as stories. Samson, I want to say, is a very passionate man. He's a very passionate man. We might say that he wears his heart on his sleeve. He's a lover. He lacks emotional control. Or if we were to put it on the scale of 1 to 10, Samson only experiences emotion in ones and in tens, right? He has no emotional regulation to keep him as an even-keeled man. And we see this emotional unruliness really always in the response that he has to things. All over his story, Samson responds to things in incredibly disproportionate ways. Here we have then a man whose deep love and passion for this woman leads him to reject the wisdom of his parents. And so he goes to see the woman that he calls his wife, right? Only to find out that she has been given to another man by her father-in-law. Now, this is not just any man. I know it says his companion in the English text. The word here in the Hebrew means bosom friend. I want to give you an example of the kind of betrayal that has taken place here. It'd be as if a man on his on his wedding day, upon the moment that the preacher says, right, this always happens in the movies, it never actually happens in real life. When the preacher says, does anyone object to the union of these two people? And the best man standing to his left steps up and he says, I do, I love her. And then they proceed to get married right in front of him. That's the kind of betrayal that's taken place here. We would never imagine this kind of deep backstab taking place in our own lives. And so we can imagine the pain and the anger that Samson felt. And by the way, the fix for this is not to say, hey, by the way, I have a younger, prettier sister as the father-in-law. Do you want to marry her instead, right? That doesn't work for a man who's in love with the other daughter. I think that's to misunderstand the reason why Samson is distressed. But it also shows us something else, that Samson does indeed have misguided intentions, and he never does intentionally act apart from his own self-interests to fulfill his duties as a judge and liberate God's people. And he knows he's a judge. There's no way, for starters, that you have a birth like Samson's, where an angel of the Lord appears to you, and you don't know that your duty is to deliver God's people. But this time, it's his distress that, instead of his anger and frustration, that leads him to afflict the Philistines. It's his vengeance that leads him to pursue this. And this time he will be justified, as he says. So while he is supposed to act as a deliverer who intentionally acts to deliver God's people, God nonetheless uses Samson's misplaced priorities to lead him to afflict the Philistines. And the result is that Samson would become a destroyer of the Philistines, who begins to do just as it was prophesied that he would do, save his people. Now, Samson's response here, as I said, is because of God's work in line with God's intentions. He doesn't afflict his father-in-law and his wife, as the text says. Rather, he pours out his wrath on the Philistines as a whole. He destroys the Philistines as a whole. He knows his duty is to begin to deliver Israel. And so an emotionally distraught Samson unleashes literally his fiery fury on those responsible for the suffering of his people. So the suffering here of Samson serves as a nexus through which the affliction of God's people is avenged by God in his providence. And it begins this cycle of revenge and vengeance, action and reaction in our story. That's what's going to drive the narrative movement of our story. In pursuing vengeance, therefore, for his personal woes, God, through Samson, pursues vengeance for the affliction of his people. And that's a wonderful thing, because it makes Samson this cunning and crafty trickster, right? Not many of us, I think, even out here in in farm country where you might participate in this kind of thing more than city folk do. Not many of us are capable of catching a lizard, let alone a fox, but Samson here catches 300 foxes. And he takes these 300 foxes, kids, and he turns them tail to tail. This is like something out of the story of Hercules or Beowulf, if you're familiar with, I think you're more familiar with Hercules. But the difference between these fictional stories, these make-believe stories that you might hear as a child, and Samson's story is that this actually happens. And so Samson takes these foxes that he's turned tail to tail and tied together, and he lets them loose amongst the crops. And we remember that it's the time of the wheat harvest, so it would be a very dry time, the time when they've been collecting all of the crops. The land is dry, the crops are ripe, they're fully grown, and they're ready to be harvested. And Samson brings this torch to the foxes, and he lets them loose amongst the crops. It burns the crops that have yet to be harvested, and it also burns the crops that have also been harvested. So it's one thing really for the dry crops, like the grain, to go up in smoke, the one both harvested and not harvested. But it's a totally different thing for these thick, life-filled trees, olive trees, to go up in smoke. This is really and truly pure destruction. It would utterly cripple a nation, I think, in the ancient world, right? Agriculture at that time was the foundation of life. There's nothing you depend on like agriculture. It's the source of trade. It's the source of all your food. You can imagine for the olive trees that they would trade olive oil especially. This would utterly cripple and decimate a nation in the ancient world. It's unparalleled destruction. Without food, then how can a people, let alone an army who is intended to afflict the Israelites, survive? But Samson has burned it all away, and so his actions completely cripple their survival and their economy. But in response to this, as I said, action and reaction, the Philistines don't hold Samson himself responsible. They hold whom they call his father-in-law and his wife responsible for as the ones who kindle his anger. So in the eyes of the Philistines, notice this marriage is still reputable. His marriage to the wife isn't void. They recognize the Timnite and his daughter as Samson's wife and father-in-law. The marriage to the bosom friend is void. And so the Philistines unleash on his family what Samson has unleashed on them. The fire unleashed on his family, though, does not clearly please Samson, right? The best way they think, to hurt Samson is to burn his family, to hurt his family. And they're right. For once again, this incurs the wrath of Samson. And so Samson says, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit. So once again, because they violated him, Samson is spurred to action to avenge both himself and the suffering of God's people. And just as he said, he strikes them with a great blow, and after that he retires to the cleft of the rock of Etam. So his thirst for personal vengeance, his vendetta, has been quenched. But the cycle clearly doesn't end here, because we know that if Samson has now struck them, they are going to want to strike him once again. And that's exactly what happens. The Philistines, the object of Samson's wrath, go once again to strike Samson. But this time, it just so happens that they encamp against Judah. They make a raid on Lehi. So they send their military presence down, and they start raiding Lehi. It just so happens that their crops have all been burned. We wonder why they're raiding Lehi, by the way. And so the people of Judah come out and question this. And they say, why are you doing this? And the Philistines say to them, we are only doing to you what Samson has done to us. And oddly enough, the men of Judah, rightly angered with Samson, go down to him and they question Samson. And Samson says the same exact thing. I'm only doing to them what they've done to me. Right? That's an ironic answer. Who started it, we wonder. And so we see the general principle driving this story in both accounts of the people is one of personal vendetta, personal vengeance, doing to others what they have done to us. That is, until this point in the story. At this point in the story, things change for Samson. Samson's thirst for vengeance has been quenched. Vengeance for him is finished. But now something else will spur him to action against the Philistines. This time, his strike will be aligned with the purposes of God. And we see this, I think, when we look at the priorities of the men of Judah. You see, instead of standing with the Lord and with their deliverer, they are willing to hand him over to their enemies. They have rejected Samson. And so this rejection of Samson is really a rejection, as I said earlier, of the Lord and of his deliverance offered by his servant against his anointed. And we think back to chapter 1, once again, where we're told that the men of Judah were really commissioned to be the men that would lead Israel out against the Philistines. This was their specific commission. They were supposed to be the ones leading the charge. But instead, they're the ones handing over their deliverer that God has raised up on their behalf. And by the way, Samson is from Dan. He's not a man of Judah. So their current Lord then is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the Philistines. That's whom they have accepted as their Lord and their teacher. They have no hope. How can they prevail against this mighty army, the Philistines? How can they get hit by them and keep moving forward? So their operating principle is you don't bite the hand that feeds you. The Philistines are the one who feed us and provide for us, not God. And Samson has therefore bit the hand that feeds us. We will therefore hand him over to be put to death. He's a fool in the eyes of the men of Judah. And yet, despite all of this, despite their betrayal against God, against Samson, notice, Samson, who normally shirks his duties as a judge, will not, despite all of that, raise up a hand to strike the men of Judah. The very people who Samson was sent to save deliver him to the Philistines, but he will not battle against God's people to save his own skin. This man who has formerly, in every instance in his story, acted to deliver himself, to promote his own self-interests, to save his own skin, will now act willingly to be bound and to be handed over to his enemies. And I think this is an action of faith. This is an action of faith. It reminds me of the story of Abraham and Isaac. When the servant notices that there's no offering, Abraham tells the servant, "You wait here, I and the boy will go, and then we shall return." Samson willingly allows himself to be bound because he has faith that the Lord will deliver him from the hand of the Philistines. He doesn't need to strike out against his own men to save his own skin. And by the way, Samson's in quite a strategically advantageous place. The cleft of the rocks of Etam is a place where only one or two people can fit, these really shallow caverns that nobody else can fit through. He's safe, and he willingly allows himself to be bound. He asks only that the men of Judah will not strike him themselves. And as the men of Judah hand him over, upon the war cry of the Philistines, the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon the believing servant. And with the fresh jawbone of a donkey he takes up in his hand, he strikes down 1,000 men. Now, I'm assuming most of you have probably seen a lot more maybe bones than I have of animal carcasses. But I'm telling you, I think a jawbone of a donkey is quite the poor choice of weapon, especially against the superior weaponry of the Philistines. A jawbone of a donkey is no match for iron swords, except for when those iron swords are matched against a man empowered by the Spirit of the Lord. The Philistines are indeed no match for that kind of man. And so, having finished his battle, Samson stops, he boasts in himself, and he crafts this poetically nifty, self-exalting poem of his own victory and of his own strength. And we're right to take this as Samson boasting. That's exactly what he does. But the narrator does not let us think in any way that it was Samson who was in charge for this victory. There's a moment of dramatic irony. We know that it was the Spirit of the Lord who rushed upon him in power that gave him victory. It was the Spirit of the Lord who was responsible for the destruction that he wreaked upon the Philistines. It was not his own strength or might. The Spirit of the Lord is their deliverer. And though we know that it's the Spirit at this point in the story who has delivered Samson, there's more to the story because it doesn't just stop with his crafty and nifty poem. Samson's hubris will not prevail over even him. So Samson here boasts in himself, while he is forgetful, while he may be even intentional to steal the glory of the Lord for victory, God makes the point to Samson and to us today that Samson is as helpless without the Spirit to destroy armies as he is to procure water for himself to keep himself from dying of thirst. Something as simple as that. You think you can destroy 1,000 men of the Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, yet you can't deliver yourself from dying of thirst? No. However, Samson will not die of thirst. For unlike the rest of Israel at that time, in these dark times, Samson will call upon the name of the Lord and ask for deliverance. And so the name of the place is given as En-Hakkore. No longer is the name of the place Ramoth Lehi, which we're told means jawbone hill, but it's given as, which is given rather as a name for Samson's victory, where he slayed 1,000 men, but instead the name is changed to recognize that true power comes from those who call the name of the Lord. That's what En-Hakkore means, the spring of him who called. And so the story closes, not telling as it does with the other judges that the land had rest. Samson has only acted as a judge for 20 years, it tells us, while we know from Judges chapter 14 that the Philistines reigned over Israel for 40 years. What are we to make of this? We'll return to it. We'll return to that. I think we treat Samson as, quote-unquote, black sheep of the family of the book of Judges, right? The modern reader may be embarrassed by Samson and question why God would use someone as selfish as him. And I think we misread Samson if we do that. Here is a man that's listed alongside David and Samuel, Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, Jacob, Moses, and the other judges in the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, where it is written, "And what shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and of David, of Samuel and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight." Those are the kinds of deeds that he's listed alongside. So I wonder, perhaps, just perhaps, Samson was a man of his age, and that age was one of darkness and apostasy. He was a man who had faith in dark times among the people of God. When people were turning towards false gods, when they were turning toward cultic practices, when they were trusting in the work of their own hands or in things that they could see and trust in with tangible reality that would provide answers and security for their lives. That's the context he was in. He was a man who lived when many walk as enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and who glory in their shame, with minds set on earthly things. That's the description that Paul gives in Philippians chapter 3 of those who were in his own church at one point, part of the visible body of believers. I'm not saying that's you. I'm saying that it's very real that there are people who are a visible part of the body of believers that seek security from things that are not God. Instead of calling on the name of the Lord, they look to things that they can trust in by themselves, that they can tangibly hold and touch. And so now we, in our own dark times, like Samson, aren't so different. We have that spirit that rushed upon him in power, giving victory. And so perhaps, just like Samson, we struggle against the sins prevalent in our age. Perhaps we're prone to fall for men or women that we should not. Perhaps, like him, we're prone to pursue our own agendas, yet by God's providence come to fulfill his purposes for our lives. Perhaps we're prone to glory in our spiritual battles or our physical battles or whatever they may be that are not ours to glory in, that we didn't achieve victory in. And perhaps we come to the Lord facetiously in prayer, questioning how God could ever fail to deliver us. And perhaps, like the people of Israel in those days, we struggle to stand side by side together as one body of believers for the faith of the gospel, not being frightened in anything, but confidently trusting God to provide for us and deliver us from the particular troubles of our own age, troubles which we have no control over. Samson was a man, I think, like any other. I don't think we should see him as this terrible man. He believed. He believed that God would deliver him from the Philistines. And when no one else would, which is incredibly hard to do, kids, isn't it? When nobody else is doing the right thing, it's hard to be the one who does it alone. But when nobody else would, Samson alone calls on the name of the Lord. But as an imperfect deliverer, he highlighted the need for a deliverer who would accomplish perfect rest. He highlighted the need for a deliverer who had pure motives, whose agendas were in line with God's, and who would exact perfect justice upon the enemies of God's people. Samson showed the need for a deliverer who would never leave the ending of the story with the knowledge that the enemies of God's people still reigned over them. But the good news is that deliverer has come. He came as a humble servant, we considered this morning. He did not exalt himself or glory in his own victories, but he came to give glory to the Father. That's what he said in John's gospel. He came to accomplish perfect deliverance by resting in the power of the Spirit in the weakness of the flesh, so that through that power of the Spirit helping and aiding the weakness of the flesh, he might accomplish perfect deliverance and obedience, a perfect deliverance from the bonds of sin and death. And so he came, and letting himself be bound, he did not break free from his bonds as Samson did to strike down his enemies, but he burst the bonds of death by his death. He did not cry out for deliverance on the cross as his enemies bound him to be put to death, but he cried out the ultimate cry of abandonment and accursedness. And on that cross, the Father did not revive him, but consigned him to abandonment, to be judged by the greatest enemy of all, that is death. And the result of that story, then, is the story of a true deliverer who perfect rest purchased. And that's a rest that we now taste in part, by the way. For we ourselves, by the power of his resurrection, as the Heidelberg Catechism puts it, rest from our evil ways. Let the Lord work in us and through us by his Spirit, and so begin in this life now the eternal Sabbath. See, the enemies of God's people do not reign over us any longer. And that Spirit doesn't just rush upon us in times of trouble, as it did with Samson, in times of crisis, to redeem or to preserve Israel, but he now dwells as permanently affixed, taking up a seat in our hearts. And so we look around us and we see a dark world. Israel too experienced this darkness. They were surrounded by enemies. They were ill-equipped for war. They didn't know how to farm the land. They didn't have security. And we look back and really we ought to be astounded and surprised that somehow Israel would make it through these dark days when they were faithless to God. But we're not surprised. We're not surprised because God is faithful to his covenant promises to deliver. That all the way back then, through the most hopeless of circumstances, he delivered his people. How much more now? In the hearts of the people in whom his Spirit dwells, will he continue to sustain us? Will he continue to watch over us? And will he continue to deliver us from all things? That's a hope that we have that is unchallengeable. No matter what dark circumstances in the world permeate our lives, we can always trust him to deliver us in the weakness of our flesh, by the power of his Spirit, by the merits of what Christ, our true deliverer, has purchased for us.
Thank you for watching or listening to our podcast. Belgrade URC is a Bible-believing Reformed confessional church that seeks to cultivate community around our Savior. If you desire to learn more about Christianity, please join us for worship each Sunday at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. If you're not able to attend church, you can tune in to our Sunday live stream through our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our current sermon series and weekly meditation through iTunes or your favorite podcast catcher. If we are not listed on your favorite podcasting host, please let us know through our webpage, urcbelgrade.com. You can also utilize our archive sermon series on our website, urcbelgrade.com. Most of all, we hope to see you sojourning and fellowshipping with us each Sunday. Until we meet again, may the Lord's blessing and peace be upon you.